work is I will introduce our two speakers for the morning, and we'll hold questions until after each of them has spoken. Danielle is recording this, and basically our last conference was a virtual conference, and we posted it on our website, well, actually on the Foundation's YouTube channel afterwards, so that other people can have access, especially if they weren't able to travel there for this. So, without any further ado, and Danielle and I will be around all day, so if you have questions about anything, please just let us know or stop us or something. Okay, so our first two papers are kind of overview aspects of Lewis. Ralph is going to be speaking on two guys from Minnesota, two literary anniversaries. Lewis and Fitgerald, because 1925 was a big year for both of them. Ralph has been his second term as president, right?
Since 2017, when Frederick Betts sent me an email saying it's time for me to stop. So.
And Ralph has been published in a number of publications on Lewis, and currently is also a tutor. I will save my introduction of Dennis until after Ralph has spoken. So take it away.
About half an hour ago, this check was working. See? There, okay. Two guys from Minnesota, two literary anniversaries. 100 years ago this month, a Tennessee jury convicted John Thomas Scopes of the crime of teaching the theory of human evolution. Adolf Hitler published Volume 1 of Mein Kampf. Lou Gehrig hit his first Grand Slam. Benito Mussolini consolidated his power. And Variety called Charlie Chaplin's silent movie The Gold Rush the greatest comedy ever. And this tale was told in 1925. From Yunnan in China, from the clattering bright bazaars crept something invisible in the sun and vigilant by dark, creeping, sinister, ceaseless. And here and there on its way, a man was black and stilled with plague. Portending the disorganized response to COVID 95 years hence, Arrowsmith is a tale of dubious medical ethics, of denial, of heroic challenges to powerful interests. Harry Sinclair Lewis was 40 years old. Arrowsmith was a bestseller. Scott Fitgerald was 28. The Great Gatsby earned critical praise, but sales were slow. It's not surprising that SL would write this story. Son and brother of esteemed doctors, Lewis would later say they were the only two people he ever wanted to impress. Although Dr. E.J. once doubted his youngest boy's prospects, a few months before his death in 1926, he told a reporter, "Harry always was a bright boy. Very keen of perception, seeing little things the others never noticed." Young Harry's adolescent diary documents activities including being the Yell King at basketball games. He wasn't an athlete, but he could yell. And he could run. Here's a cheer that he tested in a diary entry. Kuma-laka, boom-a-laka, bow-wow-wow, chinga-laka, chow, chow, chow. Are we in? Well, I guess. Sock Center High School. Yes, yes, yes. Are you all on the spirit? You want to do this?
Yeah.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Kuma-laka, boom-a-laka, bow-wow-wow, chinga-laka, are we in? Well, I guess. Sock Center High School. Yes, yes, yes.
As George Kilmer noted in his 2020 article in Midwestern Miscellany, young Harry Lewis was clearly not alone. The high school community embraced him. one embraced young Harry Longfellow. He never got, as far as we know. Here's another diary entry about classmate Myra Hendricks. What a waist, what a head, what arms, what shoulders, what legs. Oh, what a charming girl she is, and how I love her. But alas, she was not like me. Well, I mean, she did. She let him study with her.
Other girls like her.
Yeah, yes, that's right. Redress came 22 years later when Lewis endowed George Babbitt's wife with the name Myra, whose plump neck bagged, whose corsets bulged, and who nagged George to pick up the ice cream at Becky's. Lewis got over his adolescent crust, but Scott Fitzgerald didn't get over his, as we'll see in a moment. Looking back on his youth, SL concluded it was a good time, a good place, and a good preparation for life. Born 20 years after the end of the Civil War, SL likely saw sock center merchant and Union Army veteran Alfred Cullen donning his dress uniform on special occasions. And you can see that uniform in a display case at the museum down on Main Street. Meanwhile, in St. Paul, the Fitzgerald family had Southern sympathies. Young Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald, there is Daddy's knee, was distantly related to the Star-Spangled Banner's author, nurtured on Civil War stories written by his father Edward, who, as a boy, guided rebel spies through Maryland, and whose first cousin was Mary Surratt, a co-conspirator in the Lincoln assassination, and the first woman executed by the federal government. While Edward Fitzgerald was sometimes unemployed, Scott's mother Molly kept the family afloat with inherited wealth, allowing Scott to attend the private St. Paul Academy, where he fared poorly, and then east to board at the Newman School, where he did better, but not enough to qualify for nearby Princeton until a committee agreed to admit him conditionally. There, similar to what Lewis encountered at Yale, Scott faced a social hierarchy taught by graduates of elite prep schools. He struggled academically. Unlike SL, who aced the Yale entrance exam on the second time, and took, according to Professor William Lyon Phelps, not the slightest interest in the idols of the place, athletics, societies, and so on, but was first in his class to publish in the Yale Lit magazine. A defining moment in Scott Fitzgerald's life was meeting in St. Paul a most enduring love. Not Zelda, Ginevra King, during Christmas break 1915, at a party a few miles from the Fitzgerald's rented apartment at 593 Summit Avenue. She was 16, visiting a classmate at the Connecticut boarding school from which she was later expelled. He was 18, home from Princeton, and he was smitten. A few kisses, a deluge of love letters when they returned to their schools, and then, in the summer of 1960, his hopes high, Scott visited Ginevra at her summer home in Lake Forest, Illinois, a Chicago suburb favored by wealthy hog butchers, chewing gum makers, and stockbrokers like Ginevra's dad. At some point during the visit, someone, probably Mr. King, spoke within Scott's hearing the discouraging words, "Poor boys shouldn't think of marrying rich girls." Depressed and on academic probation, Scott withdrew from Princeton, joined the Army, and while stationed in Alabama, met Zelda Sayre, to whom he professed his love 3 days after. Ginevra King married Bill Mitchell, the son of one of her father's business associates. Critic Maureen Corrigan observes, Ginevra, even more than Zelda, is the love who lodged like an irritant in Fitzgerald's imagination, producing the literary pearl that is Daisy Buchanan. And the pearl of underprivileged Midwestern college dropout Jimmy Katz, transitioning into ostentatiously wealthy Jay Gatsby. Of Daisy's husband, Tom Buchanan, importing polo ponies from Lake Forest, Illinois, where Ginevra's Bill Mitchell was a player, and Ginevra's friend Edith Cummings, known as the Fairway Flapper, who served as a model for Daisy's friend Jordan Baker, who, like bond salesman and narrator Nick Carraway, has trouble bonding. Not quite 2 years after the fateful day when Scott and Ginevra met, the Lewis family, SL, wife Gracie, and their son Wells took up residence for several months at 516 Summit Avenue in St. Paul, across the street and down away from Mary Fitgerald's parents, who had moved to an apartment at 599 Summit. SL had already achieved recognition from his earlier writing and was gathering momentum to write Main Street. The Lewises left by the time Scott returned to Summit Avenue, despondent over Zelda's refusal to marry him until he had proven himself as a writer, which he did with the publication of This Side of Paradise, his debut novel inspired by his Princeton experiences and relations with Ginevra and Zelda. The first contact between the two guys from Minnesota came in an unsolicited, seemingly congratulatory letter sent in early 1921 to Lewis from Fitgerald, who called Main Street the best American novel. The amount of sheer data in it is amazing. As a writer in Minnesota, let me swell the chorus after a third reading. Yet a month before, Fitgerald wrote to editor Burton Raskow a snarky assessment of contemporary writers. I still think Mooncalf is punk. Poor White is fair, and Main Street is wrong. In her memoir, Grace Edgar Lewis recalled that they didn't know Fitgerald when they received his letter, and they met with him very little thereafter. SL and Gracie were among visitors to the Whiteberry Yacht Club north of St. Paul, where Scott and Zelda held forth until after one too many rowdy parties, they were asked to leave. Around that time, the idea for Arrowsmith began to germinate. Dr. Morris Fishbein, physician and managing editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, had written a favorable review of Main Street, after which Lewis came to see him in Chicago. The same afternoon, Dr. Paul DeCrook was there testing products such as Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound as a substitute for liquor during Prohibition. After sampling the specimens, Dr. DeCrook became ill, but he recovered enough to join Dr. Fishbein and Lewis on a taxi trip to a sanitarium where former Socialist Party candidate Eugene Debs was a patient. At the time, Lewis was planning a later novel, one of the few times he was planning a later novel, with a Debs-like character as the protagonist. Debs met with the trio on the sanitarium steps, and they talked till dawn. On the way back, Dr. Fishbein suggested that Lewis not write a later novel, but a medical one. Lewis asked him for help with it. Fishbein declined, but DeCrook was game. Like Morris Fishbein, who sought to expose unscrupulous practices, Paul DeCrook considered himself a medical debunkologist and saw SL as a master muckraker. The two signed a contract with publisher Alfred Harcourt, then went off together on a voyage to the Caribbean, collaborating on research and drafting the book's plan. Lewis promised Harcourt that this would be the meatiest of all his books. Characters, places, contrasting purposes, and views of life. Sheer data, indeed. DeCrook said they crafted Martin Arrowsmith's mentor Max Gottlieb as a blend of German, Jewish, American, atheist, quantitative biological scientist Jacques Loeb, with whom DeCrook had worked at Rockefeller Institute in Fort Wayne, and bacteriologist Frederick Noby, under whom he studied at the University of Michigan. And under Gottlieb's sway, Young Martin is torn between easing the suffering of those he can see versus devotion to scientific protocols that might later help people he doesn't see, the generations to come. As Arrowsmith made its way to our publication and work on the fraudulent evangelical Elmer Gantry began, Gracie and Wells were often left behind. Separations became more frequent. And finally, in a letter to Alfred Harcourt, Gracie said she'd hold out only a little longer. For him to divorce God and wife simultaneously, she said, would be bad publicity. But Gracie finally obtained a Nevada divorce, and days later, SL and crusading journalist Dorothy Thompson were married in London. Early in SL's marriage to Gracie, she realized the book came first, and it always would. And Dorothy, reflecting after her divorce from Lewis, similarly wrote that he cared about his work above all. I don't think this shot was in the movie. I think it was cut. SL's creation of Art and Arrowsmith is likewise obsessive about work. The word work, in one form or another, appears 474 times in the novel. Martin often dismisses his first wife, Leora, and he spurns the affection and commitment of his second wife, wealthy socialite Joyce Landon, yelling at her, "I've got to work evenings. I can't be regular and easy about it when I'm caught by a big experiment any more than you could be regular and easy and polite when we were just dating the baby." At the remote Vermont outpost where Martin collaborates with Terry Wickett, there's no room for wife and baby, nor interest in honors or prizes, like the Pulitzer, which Lewis refused to accept. Similar to Martin's estrangement, Fitgerald's narrator, Nick Carraway, realizes he's unadaptable to Eastern life and returns to the northern Middle West, away from people who smashed up things and creatures and retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness. H.L. Mencken praised the charm and beauty of Fitgerald's writing, as well as the social accuracy, but dismissed The Great Gatsby overall as a glorified anecdote. To which Fitgerald rejoined, "I think the smooth, almost unbroken pattern is in protest against my own formless two novels, and Lewis's, and Dos Passos, that this was written." And to Vanity Fair editor and former Princeton classmate John Peel Bishop, Fitgerald asked, "Is Lewis's book Arrowsmith any good? I imagine mine infinitely better." In her memoir, Gracie felt SL's writing after Arrowsmith ceased to grow in style and in emotional experience. And after he won the Nobel, Lewis worried he couldn't live up to the highest standards. But he wasn't finished. Lewis famously said that while he loved America, he often didn't like it, believing that an artist's obligation is to hold the nation to its stated values. And he sympathized with underdogs. Despite rocky marriages, his commitment to women's rights goes back to having garbage thrown at him and a group of male allies on Fifth Avenue when they followed behind Gracie and others marching for women's suffrage. Inspired in part by Gracie's association with the women who founded Planned Parenthood, and partly by Dorothy Thompson's feistiness, SL championed social work in his 1933 novel Anniversaries, and his 1935 novel Imagining a Fascist Dictatorship, It Can't Happen Here, took inspiration partly from Dorothy's expulsion from Germany after she published an unflattering portrait of Hitler, and partly from the possibility that demagogic Senator Huey Long would challenge FDR for the presidency. So around the time Lewis's character Ann Vickers was advocating for better conditions in settlement houses on the Lower East Side, his Myron Weigel was learning the hotel business and work of art. And his Doramus Jessup, editor of the Fort Beulah, Vermont Daily Informer, was fighting to save American democracy and it can't happen here. Scott Fitgerald wrote a tale of privileged American expats set on the French Riviera and other European locales. Dr. Richard Diver, a psychiatrist who married his patient, later falls in love with a younger woman, a Hollywood starlet. Tender as the Night draws on painful material emanating from Zelda's mental illness and Scott's deteriorating condition. Familiar elements fill the page. Like Ginevra King, Dick Diver's wife Nicole comes from a wealthy family rooted in Lake Forest, Illinois. Tender as the Night was a critical success but did not sell well. Author John O'Hara explained, the book came out at precisely the wrong time. No matter how good it was about the bad people, the well-fed, well-housed, well-educated, well-born, the villains of the Depression. It was a time for Odettes and the imitators of Odettes, and of Steinbeck and the imitators of Steinbeck. Fitgerald's magazine stories kept the wolf at bay, but he felt emotionally depleted. His friend and fellow writer James Gould Cousins commented, "There's no better trade calculated to drive you to drink, especially if you practice as Scott did, the Saturday Evening Post end of it." Lewis also wrote for the Post and other magazines, and for anybody here who doesn't know, he had significant problems with alcohol too. Fitgerald believed that writers have only 2 or 3 momentous experiences in their lives on which to base stories. Experiences so great and moving that it doesn't seem that anyone else has been so caught up and pounded and dazzled and astonished and beaten and broken and rescued and illuminated and roared and humbled in just that way before. So they tell these 2 or 3 stories, each time in a new disguise. And as he later observed in Hollywood, taking things hard, from Ginevra to Joe Lank. That stamp goes into my book so that people can read it blind like bread. Hollywood was Fitgerald's last hope, but he wasn't happy there. Isn't Hollywood a dump you go to around? In the human sense of the word? Hideous town. Pointed up by the insulting gardens of its rich and full of the human spirit of the new hope. Coloring his attitude toward the town was his close-up view of the industry's dedication to trumping, pardon the expression, for its prominence in storytelling. I saw that the novel, which at my maturity was the strongest and simplest medium for conveying thought and emotion from one human being to another, was becoming subordinated to a mechanical communal art in which words were subordinated to images. There was a rankling indignity in seeing the power of the written word subordinated to a more glittering, grosser power. In a review of a book published last month on the movie moguls of the 1930s, New Yorker writer Adam Gopnik refers to this quote, and he explains that communal art distinguishes film from literary fiction by applying not only to the collaboration of multiple writers, producers, directors, and crews to the filmmaking enterprise, but also to the experience of the audience in a darkened theater. The studios paid well, but rejected or altered many of Fitgerald's assignments. Yet he met a producer he respected, Irving Thalberg, around whom Fitgerald centered The Love of the Last Tycoon, a novel that remained unfinished at the time of his death. Its narrator, a recent Bennington College grad, remembers the literature faculty there pretending indifference to movies, but really hating them down deep as a threat to their existence. And she applauds the leadership of the central character, producer Monroe Starr, taking filmmaking way up past the range and power of the theater. Starr thinks himself a merchant, telling one writer, "I want to buy what's in your mind," and to another, that movies take people's own favorite folklore and dress it up and give it back to them. This sympathetic portrait of Monroe Starr, based on Thalberg, a Brooklyn-born Jew who rose to the top of the film industry before dying of heart disease at age 37, contrasts with Fitgerald's previous grotesque characterizations of Jews as he exhibits here an insider's knowledge. For example, using a word for synagogue generally unfamiliar to Gentiles when his narrator praises Starr's intense respect for learning, a racial memory of the old shoals. Not quite destitute, Fitgerald rented a Hollywood apartment that coincidentally shares the street name of his St. Paul birthplace, Laurel Avenue. Paying, he said, the most he could afford and not look poor. A block away from the last love of his life, syndicated columnist Sheila Graham, who was born Lily Shield in a London slum, raised in a Jewish orphanage, and always nervous about her past being revealed. Personal fun fact. My maternal grandfather used the pseudonym Graham to get reservations at hotel and restaurants that discriminated against Jews. I don't know if he was inspired by Sheila Graham. When Sheila revealed to Fitgerald her lack of formal education, he designed a curriculum for what he and she called the College of One, focusing on the arts and humanities. Scott's health declined, and when climbing the stairs to his second-floor apartment became too difficult for him, he moved to Sheila's ground-floor apartment, which is where he died of a heart attack in December of 1940. Scott's tutoring Sheila Graham was similar to how SL would devote himself to raising the cultural awareness of young Marcel Powers. Around the time he fashioned Cass Timberlake, the story of a not-quite elderly judge's campaign to convince a young woman many years his junior to marry him. There's a film version starring Spencer Tracy and Lana Turner, but other post-Nobel novels never got to the silver screen, at least true to the text. Issues of abortion and adultery were cut from the Ann Vickers movie. The studios killed a film project of It Can't Happen Here out of fear of the German reaction, and then refused to produce a screenplay SL worked on in Hollywood called Storm in the West, an allegory of Hitler and Mussolini likenesses terrorizing the American frontier. Of Hollywood, SL said, I just like the whole business, the taboos, that all really stirring issues, political, racial, biological, must be sidestepped or not even approached. Those concerns didn't trouble SL's publisher Random House, which brought out 3 novels in the 1940s dealing head-on with stirring issues. Gideon Planish is a prescient tale of a college professor turned public relations hack, working for grifters and fearmongers. In Kingsblood Royal, Neil fails to keep knowledge of his mixed-race lineage away from the citizens of Grand Republic, Minnesota, who pressure him to quit his job and leave his home. And in The God Seeker, evangelical acolyte Aaron Gadd questions his received notions of natives as soulless savages, and Mary Celine, the biracial daughter of a white trader and Dakota Sioux woman. They raise their kids in 1850s St. Paul, where Aaron runs a construction firm, encourages his employees to unionize, finds shelter for a runaway slave, and later hires him as an equal among other workers. Often criticized for failing to offer solutions, Lewis here embraces secular inclusion to resolve the ills he identifies. Written quickly, these novels lack the careful attention Lewis lavished on characters in his earlier work, and what they gain in sardonic wrath, they may lose in artistry, but some people still appreciate. While researching for The God Seeker, Lewis made his final visit to Sauk Center, where at a Chamber of Commerce dinner, he praised the pioneers but criticized what he called their philosophy of prejudice. God Seeker may be the best book I've ever written, told a friend. It is certainly the most serious. As well as at a Duluth mansion, in the 1940s, Lewis lived at Thorbell Farm, described by a visitor, Barnaby Conrad, as 770 acres of rolling fields and woodlands, complete with a trout stream, swimming pool, tennis court, guest houses, barn, and a 7-bedroom, 5-bath house. Before he died in 1940, Scott Fitgerald thought himself a failure, that his books might be headed for obscurity. He was almost right. In the mid-1940s, Gatsby sold less than 200 copies before going out of print. When a nonprofit organization picked it up, printed, and sold to the armed forces 155,000 copies, which reignited Fitgerald's popularity. Tens of millions of copies have since been sold, translated into dozens of languages, with multiple film and musical adaptations, exhibits such as earlier this year at the Minnesota History Center, a 100th anniversary deluxe edition, and even a video game. The Modern Library ranks Gatsby at number 2 in its list of 100 best novels. Tender is the Night at number 28, and Main Street at number 60. Neither Arrowsmith nor any other Lewis novel is ranked. Why not? The negative tone of Mark Shor's biography takes some blame. Then there's John Updike's complaint, echoed by other critics, that Lewis's novels took their inspiration from a sociological topic, rather than a confession or self-exploratory impulse. High school and college teachers struggling to get students to read a whole book, tapping young interest in romance and glitz, more often assign Fitgerald's 189-page novel versus Lewis's 450-page reader. By one count, The Great Gatsby appears on over 3,000 college syllabi, while Arrowsmith is only on 86. But there's the issue of quality. In some upper division history and science courses, Arrowsmith is the only work of fiction among other required texts. And it continues to inspire debate among medical professionals and laypersons, especially in the current climate of opposition to vaccines and attacks on research institutions. Lewis and Fitgerald, the two guys from Italy, what'd I say?
You said two guys from Italy.
Yeah, I was thinking about spirituals and two guys from Minnesota. Two giants of American literature. Made their mark and their legacies endure in our time of egregious wealth, Darwinian cuts to the social fabric, and hostility to science. These are some anthologies, edited and reissued intros written by Lewis Society members Anthony DiRenzo, George Killo, and Sally Clare. And I thank you.
I do have to set up my computer. You want to introduce me? You want to?
I do. Okay, you do that, and yeah, okay, I would now like to introduce Dennis Morgan, who is going to be speaking on making around to Dr. Arrowsmith, and Dennis's medical career has been a lot of similarities to Paul McCrory, so it's quite interesting. He's a retired physician and writes a column on the history of medicine. While he's getting set up, Patty Lewis shared with me from 16-year-old Lewis's diary about the beginning of his father's medical career at Sauk Center. And so, this is one of my, I didn't bring this up last time, this is one of my dreams is to get Lewis's diary published, because it does exist at Yale. So Lewis writes, when he went to Irontown with a wife and two children, $800 in debt, and $25 in his pocket, the people of Irontown, Wisconsin welcomed him with open arms and were very kind to him. They used to come and take him out back in their own buggies and wagons. When they did not do this, Father would have to walk, no matter how far. Father made his first medicine case by getting a small wooden box and fixing it up, putting in 2-ounce bottles. Mother's first dressing table was a wooden packing case modified by Father. Father has since paid the debt and become worth $10,000 or $15,000. Raised 3 boys, given Claude a college education, had expenses of $2,000 a year for years, and had many other causes for spending money all through his own efforts. If he had not been such a persistent worker, a generous father, and a lover of education for himself and his boys, I might be working in some factory all day, and mostly in a saloon at night. And given that a lot of criticism over the years has talked about the kind of contentious relationship between Lewis and his father, I think this says a lot, that Lewis was say such nice things about his father, and then his father paid for his education. You know, I mean, that's a really big deal. So, are we set?
Yes, we are good to go.
Okay, then Dennis, take it away.
Good morning. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you today. I have a bit of a non-COVID lingering cough, so I've got some menthol on. We'll find out if the doctor can chew gum and talk at the same time. I wrote Dr. Perry and said, you know, the ghost of Arrowsmith has been following me around my entire career. So she gave me an opportunity to demonstrate why I think that is. And we're going to do a little exercise in making rounds with Dr. Arrowsmith, as you know, going around the hospital or around the country. So this is necessarily a personal perspective. There's no one physician view of Arrowsmith, right? It's just, in my case, my view of Arrowsmith. So it seemed only fair to give you some personal perspective of how I arrived at my impressions about the novel. And I want to discuss a bit the duality of de Graaf and Lewis in the collaborative creation of the book, which some have called a synergy of talents. And we're going to take a bit of a road trip to look at the origin of the model, the geographic places where they collaborate. And by the end of this, we will discover a little bit more about Leora's demise and that fatal cigarette. Just where did that bacteria come from? If there are any take-home messages, I would suggest with these, that science, medicine, and society are inextricably intertwined, just as were the talents of Lewis and de Graaf in the zeitgeist of the 1920s. And in my opinion, Arrowsmith is a medical novel, not just a research novel. And we will find out some cigarettes. So, I graduated from the University of Michigan with an MD in 1977. Paul de Graaf got his PhD there in 1916. Then I did a year of pathology at the University of North Carolina. And I'm as fond of my microscope as Martin Arrowsmith was of his. You know, so he packed that up when he ran out of town. But I switched to internal medicine. I went to Cook County Hospital, which is a legendary public inner city hospital in Chicago. Very down and dirty, nuts and bolts, run by the house officers. But if you drag yourself to the threshold, it damn sure got taken care of. Following that, I went into a fellowship in hematology and oncology at the University of Connecticut, where I did, I stayed on the faculty for a while, did some research into coagulation and cancer. I was on the Institutional Review Board, which would do things like review applications to use bacteriophages to treat bubonic plague in the Caribbean. We never had any of those, but you know, it was this day and age. Like Martin Arrowsmith, we installed telephones when he was in college. I had been in the Air Force and I was an electronic technician before I went to college, so I worked at a radio station with computers. Then I got into a bit of a, socially oriented bent and wrote a letter to the Hartford Current some time ago about the incursion of big pharma on academic departments in medical schools. And that actually won a letter to the editor of public campaigns that kind of reminded me of pickleball's occasional excesses where public health campaigns can be kind of self-serving and ineffective. And following my time in the university setting, I went into private practice, and that brought me into the arena of benefactors like, the Charlie Nirenberg, self-made millionaire, and the Phoenix Mutual Insurance Company, who gave money so we could establish a new community cancer center. And I joined the Physicians for National Health program. As president of the Connecticut Oncology Association, I made acquaintances with a few U.S. Congress people, some more friendly than others, as you can see here. Then when I retired, as some physicians tend to do, got an interest in the history of medicine. And I've been writing a column for this physician site called Ceremony for a number of years now, including opportunities to talk about Arrowsmith along the way. And you have one article in the newsletter. And I've done some research at the New York Academy of Medicine, the Morgan Library Museum, and the Yale Library. As a member of the American Association for the History of Medicine, this year in Boston, I went to the 100th annual meeting, and Dr. Rosenberg was the honoree, and Ileana Lowy was the keynote speaker honoring him, and also Dennis was William Summers, the only one of those three that I'm personally acquainted with, except keynote speaker Lowy got tired out at the post-banquet thing and got dragged to our table just to take a rest, so I'll show you about that in a second. Dr. Rosenberg wrote Scientist as Hero by Arrowsmith, 1963. And Lowy wrote Arrowsmith and the Doctor's Dilemma in 1988. And Summers wrote The Origins of Science in Arrowsmith in 1991. So I mention these not to name drop, but to say, this book has been of great interest to historians of medicine for decades, and will continue to do so. So, this is me and some people I met at the meeting. The woman in the center is at the University of Michigan, and she's working on institutional history. The gentleman on the right just happens to be an anesthesiologist affiliated with Harvard, and also an amateur medical historian. Go figure. Only he hasn't retired yet, so I don't know what he's okay. The duality. It's a product of its age, right? It was the jazz age, personal freedom, progressive era, women's suffrage, contagion everywhere. And Michael North, professor of literature, said that, Wilson's Garage in The Great Gatsby, that's the geographic center of the novel, and that's on Main Street, surrounded by the wasteland. So go figure, But Thomas Wolfe later wrote that in the Billion-Footed Beast, of his admiration for Lewis as a realistic writer, and particularly for his reportorial style, right? So because of that reportorial style, we have what essentially is a document of medicine in that age, very realistically. Oh, that's Lewis's Catholic faith. We'll be turning around that. So in context, it came out in the serialization form in 24 and 25, at which time the public was very, very aware of issues like plague in Los Angeles, the great, Alaskan race to get diphtheria to serotonin. Papers are full of articles about the Nobel Prize, the nominees in Chicago for finding out that streptococcus was scarlet fever was killing 24% of cases. So this was very much a novel of its time. And from the Publishers Weekly, before the book just came out, they were promoting it as a romance, not a satire. They wanted to be very careful that the public understood this was something different, you know. Not in a satire, we got something for you. But also in the promotional material, and they talk about his birthplace in Sauk Center, and sort of start this dichotomy of country practice, scientific medicine, which perhaps was appropriate at the time, but I think in the last 100 years, there's a lot that has changed about this dichotomy between, you practice medicine or you understand science, but not both, right? So, this is a first limited edition. It's still available for sale, $14,000. No slipcover, no dust jacket. Here's a dynamic duo working over the TypeScript, and this is London or Fontainebleau. And here's who I think, since there is no geographic center to Arrowsmith, and it's not in my mind a hero's journey. He is for me like the medical everyman, right? Likeable, ordinary, desperately trying to make sense of the world as he finds it. So here are some editions. I have a signed copy of the Barbara Spade text edition. Everybody's favorite edition, the way you've seen it, you know, with the introduction by Dr. Perry. So, this scientist and dramatist. It's often, you know, overlooked that Wright was married to the doctor, and not very successful. I mean, one has to wonder if there was some bitterness there that kind of shaped his attitude. Although he had plenty of reason to be, you know, skeptical of medical education in his time, because it was pretty distant. But he was a passionate social reformer. Lewis admired his physician family, but he was thrilled by research, genuinely. So, you know, who wrote what parts of the kind of thing to write for the scientist's prayer, you know? Which, if you saw the movie last night, almost looks like a soliloquy from Hamlet, if you ask me. Kind of like you should be doing it looking in a mirror. So, this is a sort of commitment to integrity. But this is preceded directly in the text by this little snippet. Arrowsmith's looking out the windows at the Kirk. Suddenly he loved humanity as he loved the decent, clean rows of test tubes, and he prayed again for the scientists. This was a commitment to integrity, but a commitment to an intent, you know, to use the skills. So it's a duality. Harvey Cushing, neurosurgeon, was not fond of Arrowsmith. He thought people should read, students should read Doctor instead. He got the Pulitzer Prize the same year that Lewis did for his biography of William Osler. And this is from A Country Doctor. So I'm going to kind of use his own words against him a bit. In The Country Doctor, we find a man, he said, had no right to be a doctor if he does not simply make everything bend to his work of making sick people well again. And furthermore, that the practical medical men are the juries who settle all the theories of the hour as they meet emergencies day after day. So, some have criticized Arrowsmith as, you know, emphasizing glorifying research at the expense of medical practice. This is not the case. Consider, for example, a very poignant scene where the Novak family is losing their child to diphtheria, and the dramatic race through the night to try and save him. Should he do a tracheotomy or whatever? It's just heartbreaking. And also when his family gets sick, his wife is ill, he's desperate. And when he's desperate, he calls the doctor with the same urgency and hopes as any activist willing. Now, Lewis nonetheless was a big fan of research. In fact, he said, writing has been a good job, and even though it's been rather sweaty and nerve-wracking, I have enjoyed it more than I would have enjoyed anything except pure research in the laboratory. So, let's do some of that. I'm going to try and turn this graph into an illustration of the interrelationship of science, medicine, society. Let's see if I can pull it off. So, this is an experiment I did as an undergrad. It's very simple, but I wanted to see if bacteria could be protected from radiation injury by bathing them in ascorbic acid, some antioxidant to scarf up the radicals that were killing the cells. So I had to go into the nuclear reactor facility at the University of Michigan, set the plates down in this little concrete hole, push the button, run, come back and get them, and the cesium is flowing. It was pretty scary stuff. But it worked, and I was thrilled. It's a simple experiment. It shows you how, research can be exciting. So, and indeed, to my astonishment, look at this equation that shows the Arrowsmith. I'm still, gobsmacked that the editors allowed this. But I mentioned the free radicals are important in this thing. So we used to joke at the University of Michigan that free radicals were discovered in the chemistry basement, which is in fact true. Moses Gomer discovered free radicals, but we weren't talking about that. We were talking about, in fact, I worked in that building, but we were talking about these radicals, the Students for Democratic Society. Right? That's Tom Hayden and his future wife, Jane Fonda. And the Students for Democratic Society were a direct descendant of another college socialist movement founded by Sinclair. And Sinclair Lewis wasn't himself a socialist for a hot minute. So, the eminent pathologist Rudolf Virchow, a remarkable man, and he said that medicine is a social science, and politics is nothing else but medicine at a larger scale. QE. So, it's going to road trip. Basically, we can follow the Lincoln Highway, a little tour over to the Caribbean, right? We're going to start in Chicago. And the AAM offices in Cook County, in Chicago. The offices of the AMA is where Dick Reifel, Lewis met, mediated by Morris Fishbein, who was the editor of the American Journal, the Journal of the AMA. Reifel was interested in the quackery, and Fishbein was the most famous quack hunter of his time. And Lewis knew everybody, but Fishbein had written a positive review of Main Street, but they found themselves at the headquarters at the same time, talking, and the notion came about to let's do a medical novel instead of a damn labor novel that he never did. And there's the famous story of the riotous celebration going through the streets of Chicago from one bar to the next. And while no one knows where they actually went, I have to think that Morris Fishbein would have taken them to the most famous speakeasy in Chicago, called the Green Mill. The Green Mill, where that Ludot is very close to where I used to live in Chicago, that roundabout. And if you look carefully, Winnebago Park is right next to the Green Mill. I'm not saying it's so, but see, this park was built in 1910, so it was there already. I don't know. This is the west side of Chicago. And for all the emphasis of the McGurk Rockefeller, New York thing, Chicago plays an important role in the novel too. This is Rush Medical Center. The McCormick Institute for Infectious Disease was here. Pardon?
Speaking to you like a little
And is that a little better for the
Yes.
sound? Okay, good. And it was also the location of some enduring friendships that Dwight developed with Louis Hector and Morris Fishburne himself. So we find quotes in the novel such as this: Gottlieb had never visited McGurk, but he considered it next to Rockefeller and McCormick the soundest and freest organizations for research in the country. And this, when he discovered a streptococcus in the odors of cows on Klopchik's farm, he says, you know, you can farm me through the if you want to, but I think you better get Dr. Longin from Chicago to confirm this. So, in fact, both the Rockefeller and the McCormick Institutes were founded in part because of the tragic death from scarlet fever of John McCormick Rockefeller. Okay, so we're gonna head to New York. This is the publishers area in New York City, and Rockefeller Institute on the right, where Flexner fired Dwight basically for being too critical in public about the state of affairs in medicine and research. Dwight went to get a little money so he could go off and get married before they went off on a Caribbean trip. And he got $1,000 check signed by the executive secretary, the future wife of Harcourt, because nobody else was in the office. So, I did go to the New York Academy of Medicine and hold the letter, which had the key to the characteristic of the model, right? And curiously enough, you can actually find published papers that kind of map to Raymond Hussey as Arrowsmith and John Northrup as one of the models of Jerry Wicked. In addition to which, this is Thomas LeBlanc's review of Arrowsmith in Science, and he was the other model of Jerry Wicked. He says, when warns Leora's passing during the plague epidemic, what a tale it would have made had she married Terry Wicked, which was him, but I'm sure he didn't know it. So, briefly, I went to the Morgan Library. The galley proofs are there. I'm going through it. I'm going to be careful. I have a librarian sitting over here. And I said, you know, the last page is missing. And indeed it is. And I said, well, let's look for it. And she said, well, let's not, because I've already made a little slight tear on one of these edges here. So we don't know if it's truly missing or it's interpolated somewhere else. But nonetheless, it's gone. Okay, so I live in West Hartford, in a 300-year-old house. Noah Webster was born in West Hartford, and the local library has a local history section, supervised by a guy with a master's degree in history. So he helped me find more about the house that the Lewis is renting in West Hartford. And this is from a promo book written by his friend Harrison Smith. And this is Lewis in his Cadillac Phaeton in front of the house in West Hartford. This is 15 minutes away from where I live. So I wanted to, what to do. Well, I tried to brag. That was my first question. I wrote them a letter, and I said, look, I just wrote this article in genetic explorer about Lewis in Connecticut, with the research help from Patty Lewis. Thank you very much. And if you want to have me stop by it, I'll give you a copy, right? So, a month later, I get a call from the missus. And they invite me over. We spend 4 hours, a lovely couple. The owner's an architect, she's a librarian, they have a daughter who's a sophomore at Smith. So, Gracie had talked about the church windows. This room is where the current owner thinks that Lewis would have sat and done his writing. The wife talks about how lovely Gracie was coming down these stairs, you know, to present herself for dinner. This is the living room where they would have hashed out some of the details. How are we doing on the microphone? Is this still okay?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
What?
5 minutes.
5 minute, time?
About 5 minutes, because I want to have time for questions.
Okay. How about the audio? Is that okay?
Yep, that's better? Good, yep.
Okay. So, this is the couple. They, he wanted to talk about, it can't happen here, she wanted to talk about Dorothy Thompson, and the daughter wanted to know if Catherine had ever come to the house, which I think she probably had. But nonetheless, the dinner that they had there to finalize the deal was fraught with problems. It was supposed to be a co-authorship, possibly co-authority between Lewis and Roy. And there were some hitches. First of all, Lewis says, well, you know, you can't really be a second author. Publishers that would be bad for business. And Lewis gets a little tipsy and flirtatious with his wife. But they eventually iron out and they have her show up for dinner. And, you know, they look through the telephone book looking for titles. And it's unknown how much Dr. Hepburn fed into his bacteriology knowledge, but Hartford Hospital did run a influenza hospital right across the street from his house in 1918, and Hartford called, of course. And this is from Dr. Summers, his research at Yale, some of their archives showing Lewis's sketches of bacteriological procedures. So when he first gets to Hartford, they're skeptical, you know, they expose this as a one-horse town. And one of the first things he does is give a speech to the business community and calls them all baddies. Pretty much gets published in the paper by an editor who knew him at Yale and said, yeah, you know, I think you're right. He's kind of ostracized after that. This is the people I don't tell when we had that meeting. So we leave New York, right? And he's got his portable typewriter. He's off on the SS Guyana, taking both Humine and other liquors with him. And we end up in St. Hubert, where, as we know, the plague in the novel comes from China this way. But in reality, in the creation of the novel, we have a different situation. So here we are in St. Hubert, and all the resources in the earth are brought to play. Sondheim and Arrowsmith are out there giving injections of phage to try to get the plague. Dora's at home, waiting anxiously. Sondheim gets sick and dies. Leora gets sick and dies after smoking the cigarette. And Horace Fishbein wanted the novel, he thought the novel should end right there. It should be called Leora. So, in the typescript, there's a little addition about the laboratory being a fortress. And something curious with this sort of multiple factors had to happen for the failed event, which was she forgot to take her phage dose. She had a crack in her lips, so there was an entry point, and the cigarette would dry. But to understand the origin of the phage, we need to go to San Francisco in 1900, when Dr. Joseph Kenyon, the public health service officer, identified plague in San Francisco. Nobody believed him. McKinley came through town and said, nothing to see here, fake news. Imagine that. And then they condemned the public health official, imagine that. They brought in the big guns, including Noe from Michigan. They said, yeah, this is bubonic plague. We can see it, we can identify it microscopically. And he took this specimen back to Ann Arbor, where Dr. Doc was a renowned clinical professor. He and William Osler were the only two doing supervised clinical clerkships for medical education in the country. And Dr. Doc ended up treating a third-year medical student who was in Noe's lab, who got pneumonic form of bubonic plague. This is all documented by my old physiology professor, Horace Davenport, and he is as stern as that picture looks. But he went through all of Dr. Doc's notes and established that this student was fond of rolling old nerve cigarettes, and that he got infected. He survived them. So that's around the trip here, with a little bit of a coda. This again is from the Botanic Archives at Yale. Lewis had put a timeline, and when Martin Arrowsmith goes off by himself, he was only 40 years old. I like to think he would have regained his sense of humor. You know, if someone stopped him on the street and said, "You're not making a call," he would have said, "Practice, practice, practice." And then he might have even ended up being a professor of medicine at one of all the great universities we have with doctors who are researchers and clinicians. So, and then suits would be making rounds with Dr. Arrowsmith.
Thank you very much, Dennis. We have a couple times for questions. Coffee is being set up as we speak, so if you're like, deep that, we'll be here shortly plus little snacks, so. Yes, so Ralph, that's a question. Sean?
It's for anyone, do we know what island, Lewis may have faced, West Indies, I mean, from his travels, whatever, I haven't seen anyone say it was Jamaica or whatever.
Well, they did visit Barbados, they visited a hospital in Barbados, and some other points along the Caribbean coast. But the island itself is fictitious. Some San Lucia comes to mind, but I'm not sure.
I think it was San Lucia.
Yeah, San Lucia, yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yes.
This is because I can't hear very well. Neither Ralph. You said that Ginevra is sort of the model for Daisy Buchanan, but did you also say that that Fitgerald himself kind of identified with Gatsby?
No, well, I didn't say that.
Okay.
I think Fitzgerald identified with the adoration for wealth, the aspiration for wealth, the way that wealth could have made him happy as the partner, husband of Ginevra King.
So to some extent,
Yes,
some
and
extent,
so-
it does identify with Gatsby.
Yes, he created a character who could win the girl. The LA author Carolyn C. said, Fitzgerald always wanted to be with the prettiest girl.
Well, that's an interesting question, probably in a lot of trouble. What was Lewis's type? Because he married two accomplished women. His health was out, but it was very.
Well, yeah.
I think he admired smart women.
Sally's written on this. Take it away. I'll chime in.
You're years ago, I wrote an article for Studies of American Fiction on the biographical connections between Lewis's wives and the presentations in his fiction. And I think he was, you know, a lot of his novels have strong, smart women who are trying to deal with very sexist and annoying societies. And the two women that he did marry, and Marcella Powers to a lesser extent, I mean, they were accomplished women, they were smart, they were well-read or wanted to be well-read. And although there was a lot of butting of heads because, kind of like Martin Arrowsmith, you know, the work should come first. These women were accomplished in their own right, you know, especially Dorothy Thompson, who had a career very distinct from Lewis, and in the mid-30s, when Lewis was kind of going sort of a fallow period, sometimes people refer to him as you know, Mr. Dorothy Thompson, and he got really ticked off. So there's a tension there, but I think that not wealth so much as an attraction for Lewis, but smart women, and I think good for him.
I don't know what the dynamic was of the end of the first marriage, but I read an anecdote by William L. Scherer, who knew Lewis in Germany and Dorothy Thompson in Germany, and Lewis at one point took Scherer aside and said, "If she could just stop talking for 5 minutes." She was dynamic and assertive and all that, and sometimes would take attention away from him.
It's a in that sense, great. I wonder if some of the, I don't know, recent negative opinions about Lewis come from sort of more awareness of Dorothy Thompson. And I've read a couple books about her in the last few years. I know there's actually a radio play on the rise of Hitler, where there's a dialogue between them and Lewis comes out the worst.
Right, and there's a new biography of Dorothy Thompson being worked on right now. I just heard about that. I don't know, I mean, you know, Lewis's reputation kind of ebbs and flows. It was done such a terrible blow by Mark Shorer's biography that it affected generations of scholars, and I think so. There's a lot of fighting back against that. Although, you know, every time something really big and stupid happens in American society, Lewis becomes popular again because look, planes, fascism, hey, it's like somebody wrote on that. Well, I think coffee is now available.